Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 26 today after the opening scene, and as you can see on the left side of the screen at the top, David has asked two people, Ahimelech and Abishai, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul, and Abishai volunteers. So, before we enter in our passage, just a couple of things to set our context here. As you can see on the right side of the screen, ever since the beginning of chapter 24, and if you haven't been watching this, I would encourage you to watch the introductory video to these three chapters, we've been noting how tightly chapters 24, 25, and 26 are connected. 24 and 26, as you can see on the right side of the screen, are more or less, but only more or less the same story. You can see the parts that are identical in the color-coded sections, first on chapter 24 on this side and 26 on that side. And if that's too small for you to read, you can certainly download that from the website at radicalbible.net. But the point is that the parts that are in common stitch together the parts that aren't in common, which are all the parts that aren't color-coded. In chapter 24, we saw that the theme, at least in terms of the drama, was Saul went into the cave to relieve himself, and unknown to him were David and 400 of his men in the deep part of the cave. And then David goes and stealthily cuts off the corner of Saul's cloak and then feels bad about it and vows not to harm Yahweh's anointed. In our scene on the right, as we saw last time, it's a little different. Each side is seeking the other. David and Saul each looking for the other. David sent out spies and learned that Saul had arrived in this area, and Saul and his men went to sleep, and then David decides to go down there. So that's a difference in the scene that we see today. And both these chapters are connected to the middle chapter with Nabal and Abigail, as Nabal is a substitute for Saul. And today is one of those examples, as you can see on the left side of the screen, where we're told that Saul lay sleeping, that leads analysts like Barbara Green to suggest that chapter 25 was simply Saul's dream. That Nabal the fool was a substitute for himself, who Saul himself calls foolish, although using a different word than Nabal, which means fool, at the end of this chapter 26. So perhaps that's Saul's fear dream, that David would come down on him, and that he, Saul, would die and David would take his wife away. We saw at the end of chapter 25 that David not only got Nabal's wife Abigail, but got a woman named Ahinoam, which is the same name as Saul's wife. So there's some ambiguity, and scholars are divided on whether he did end up with Saul's wife. But again, is that part of the dream? The narrator seems to be intervening there with a couple of verses at the end that are apart from the narrative itself. So that's left a little ambiguous. And of course, there's nothing in the text explicitly saying it was Saul's dream. But if it's not Saul's dream, it's certainly a construction of the writer of these three chapters, which, more than any other part of 1 Samuel, seem like a unit inserted into the narrative of David's rise, and then the succession narrative that will lead to Solomon replacing David. As we've seen, there are a number of Hebrew words that are late words that are used in exilic texts and after, like Proverbs and Job, that are in this section. And the whole story seems to be centered around the question of should there be a monarchy or not. Is it Yahweh's will there be a monarchy or not? For the exilic audience, when the monarchy in Jerusalem had fallen, that would be the question for post-exile. The immediate question in the story, though, is how is David going to get Saul out of the way of David taking the reins as king? And we'll see a verse in today's passage that really highlights the options that are there. But one of the themes we've been looking at throughout all this is we saw in chapter 24 that Abigail, in her speech to David, cited Yahweh's will all over the place. And it started in 24, as we see here, where the men of David said, "Here is the day of which Yahweh said to you, I will give your enemy into your hand." And we'll see a similar thing today. But the question is, just because characters say it's Yahweh's will, is it? As we know, correlation is not causation, and there are many elements to determine whether something is Yahweh's will. So just because something happens the way you might like to have it doesn't necessarily mean it's Yahweh's will, although we tend colloquially to do that. We thank God for blessings that may or may not have anything to do with God's will. It may just be luck of the draw, or our own work, or the actions of humans in just an ordinary way. So we do have to be careful, because one of the key questions is, does the Bible as a whole give us some basis for discerning what Yahweh's will is? Or is it like these scenes here where people are just claiming Yahweh is on their side, but we have no basis for knowing if that's really true? And so we can't determine that based on individual passages, other than the question of whether we trust the narrator of the story to tell us when Yahweh is involved. And that will happen in today's scene for the first time. So we'll look at that, what we know from at least the narrator's point of view is Yahweh's will, versus what characters say. So we've also been looking at the verbal links here between chapter 25 in order on this side and chapters 24 and 26 with relevant examples on this side. And as I noted last time, there are more examples in chapter 26 I could have added, but I wanted to keep this to one page. But we'll point them out as we go along the way. We've also been looking at the key words, and we noted in the first opening section that we looked at last time, the only real key word was the fact that they're lying, and that will come up again today. But we'll see a number of key words in this section here. Yahweh is anointed, and Yahweh as a whole, the spear many times, and interestingly, repeated in the Hebrew that's always lost in the English are these repeated words, at his head twice in this section here. And then we'll see another time again there, and we'll see a whole series of doubled words, a spear doubled down here. So we'll see a number of those along the way to emphasize the importance of particular things. And the spear today takes its place in the series of phallic symbols we've seen. We saw in chapter 24 that David cut off the corner of Saul's cloak, and that might not seem like a phallic symbol to us, but biblical scholars noted that that certainly was, as Brueggemann says, a symbolic castration of Saul there. But David regrets it. We saw in chapter 25 that David told his men to strap on their swords, and it was repeated 3 times. And so the sword is playing the phallic symbol there, and today the spear. And if we think that's projecting or putting a Freudian lens on text that wouldn't think of it that way, well, let's consider this example for where the story goes. Near the very end of this sequence, when David's son Solomon has reigned, and the question is who will follow him, and it's his son Rehoboam, and the people of Israel come to him in Jerusalem and say, "Your father is harsh on us," and this is what we hear. We hear, "The young men who had grown up with him said to him, 'Thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, my father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Thus you should say to them, my little one is thicker than my father's loins.'" And then it goes on in that mode. And if I need to explain it to you, little one there, which the new RSV translates as my little finger, but there's no word there for finger in the Hebrew, is a matter of penis-size comparison. And that may seem crude to us, but it's meant to be crude. It's meant to say that Rehoboam is not sensitive to the needs of the people, and unlike Solomon, doesn't have the wisdom to hold together the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And so the crude phallic image shows how Rehoboam is crude rather than more sophisticated like Solomon, and unable to keep the monarchy, and Israel rebels. So the sequence of phallic symbols are often used to show the strength or weakness of a king or not, and that's not just true in these texts, that's true in many texts. So as we go through this, let's keep that in mind as we go. So returning to our text now. Oh, one more thing before we go. This section that we're going to look at today is this nice little chiasm from verse 7 to 12, and you can see it right there. If you're not familiar with chiasms, I've been pointing them out throughout this series and in all my series. They represent this symmetrical pattern that you can see here, where the beginning and ends are matching by verbal or thematic comparison, and then this inner part here connected, and then a center in the middle. And the center in the middle is clearly the center not just of this little chiasm, but really of the whole business here, as we'll see. So let's put the keywords up, and we can follow it here as we begin to go through our passage. So Abishai said he'd go with him. So David and Abishai go to the army by night, and as I've noted before, it's literally to the people, and it's not the army. This is not a formal situation. Although we do see in this passage, unlike in chapter 24, where it seemed as if it was just David versus Saul, even though we were told that Saul had 3,000 men and David had 400 who came, or 600, 400 who came to the Nabal situation, but 600, we only hear about David and Saul. Here we see a number of individuals named as it begins to point toward that section of the story where David is established and has a more traditional monarchy with people working for him, and that will complete that cycle in 1 Kings 4 when Solomon has a whole, what we might call a cabinet. So David and Abishai went, and there, or behold, it can be translated either way, and I put it as behold, and we can see behold as a key word, especially near the end. Behold, Saul lay sleeping within the encampment. Using the word yashin here, and that's suggesting to Green, as I noted, that chapter 25 was a dream. The word for sleeping is 4 times in these couple of verses we've seen, emphasizing that. So sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. So the spear, as we've seen it earlier, he tried to pin David to the wall with it earlier, and as Falcoman notes below, the spear is thus the exact center point of the epic space of 26:1 to 12. Saw the spear stuck in the ground, using the word milk here, which is only used otherwise in genital or other sexual situations, as you can see there in Leviticus 22:24 for pressed testicles, and in Ezekiel 23:3 for pressed breasts. If you think my notice of the spear as a phallic symbol is off, well, the verb confirms that in its other uses. So the spear is stuck in the ground at his head, and again you can see here Mereshotho Mereshashthing repeated there, and repeated 3 times, or repeated twice in this passage, but it's 6 times in this scene, in this chapter, really highlighting the vulnerability of Saul's head. And Abner and the army lay around him. And so they're there to protect, literally on all sides, and that's an adverb that's doubled, actually circled. So as you can see below, literally it's Abner and the people lay circled, yes, circled, emphasizing an adverb there, which is unusual. So given they're all circled around and all asleep, we hear this. And we're going to hear from Abishai for the first time here. It's establishing a characterization that's repeated in 2 Samuel 16:9, which we'll look at in a minute. Let's listen to this one and we'll go back to that. So Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand today. So echoing what we saw in chapter 24, when the men of David assumed that the fact that they were in the cave at the same time meant it was Yahweh's will. Here it's Elohim that's used, not Yahweh, and that was Elohim there too. But David will echo this at the end. God has given your enemy into your hand, and that's one of those things that echoes from chapter 24 and chapter 25. But is it so? Is this God's will or not? And how would one determine it? But Abishai has decided it is, and so he comes up with a plan. Therefore, let me pin him to the ground with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. Let's look at the details of that. There's a please in there, that representing the Abishai's deference to David, although David is not described as king here or anything with a title. So as Barbara Green notes below, Abishai here also evokes the confident young David, volunteering to his Lord to go against the tall man who opposes him, which is to say when he was offering to Saul to go up against Goliath. Using the word pin him, literally kenu means attack or hit, but it was exactly what Saul threatened to do to David earlier, so it's coming around that way. And he says with one stroke of the spear, literally 1 foot of the spear, which would say he'd only put one end of it in, and of the spear here, revealed in verse 22 to be Saul's own spear. I will not strike him twice, points us to this use in 2 Samuel 20:10 here, or Amasa did not notice a sword in Joab's hand. Joab struck him in the belly so that his entrails poured out on the ground, and he died. He did not strike a second blow. Then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. So there, at first it was Abishai who threatens to not need a second strike, and that is his brother Joab way later. Let's go back up to what we saw earlier, though, about the characterization of Abishai, back here in 2 Samuel 16:9, where we hear this. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, which is David, of course, at this point, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. And the dead dog image recalls chapter 24, when David said to Saul, why are you coming after a dead dog, a single flea, referring to himself this way. Abishai wasn't there for that, but that phrase is echoed here into chapter 16 to hear how that refers to somebody who's hardly worth their attention. So Abishai will play David in many ways. So he said what he says here, but David says to Abishai, do not destroy him. And notice here this echoes 24/7, the tight connection between chapter 24 and chapter 26. Do not destroy him, using a very powerful word, as Fackelman translates it, act ruinously. It's the word, as you can see down here, used 5 times in the prologue to the flood, and it's also used for Sodom and Gomorrah, for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So for the 2 primary destructive elements in the Bible, and we've seen already that there are many connections between Genesis and the books of Samuel. Which direction they're going isn't always clear. For the most part, I'd suggest that the David story is older, and Genesis is taking images from the David story and from the rest of the Deuteronomistic history and turning them into their own stories. But since I've noted that these 3 chapters may be late, may well be exilic, they might be from the same time as Genesis for all we know. So it's hard to know which came first. So do not destroy him, for who can raise his hand against Yahweh's anointed? And for some reason I don't understand, the No RSV almost always, when the Hebrew has Yahweh, renders it in all caps like we see here. But this is Yahweh as well. And a number of times it is here as well too. So why, when it's the Lord's anointed, it doesn't have it all caps, I don't know. But plainly it's Yahweh's anointed. So who can raise their hand against Yahweh's anointed and be guiltless? Using the word nuk, it's hard to pronounce there, but in the pronounceable form it's venakah, to be cleaned out or be free from guilt. Only here in Samuel, and this is now the fourth different word we've heard in these 3 chapters for guilt or innocence. It's interesting how the vocabulary is varied, given all the key words that use repeated vocabulary for emphasis. So he asks that rhetorical question and doesn't wait for an answer. And as Barbara Green notes below here about David's comment here, which we'll look at in some detail, clearly enough pondering the likely circumstances of Saul's death, showing it to be on his mind even as he distances himself from it, David generates 3, even 4 scenarios about the manner of Saul's death. So again, at the center of our chiasm, let's consider what he has to say here. Notice that as verse 9 said, he said to Abishai, and here he just said, which leads Green to suggest this is self-talk and it is self-persuasion. Falcoman similarly says this long speech, although it's really only a little over a verse, is intended for a wider audience. And that may be because obviously the whole thing is intended by the writer for the reading or listening audience. So here's what he offers. As Yahweh lives, which we heard echoing 3 times from chapter 25, and it'll be again a few verses down here in 26:16, Yahweh will strike him down, and we heard that word echoed earlier about Nabal, or his day will come to die, which is to say of old age, or he will go into battle and perish, which in the event is what happens. Literally, the word here, as the Brown Driver Griggs lexicon notes below, to be snatched away, used in other contexts for the people swept away with their king, in Samuel's words there, and then David by the hand of Saul later, used 9 times in the Masoretic text. As my note says, this in the event is what happens, but is it exclusive of Yahweh will strike him down? In other words, are these all mutually exclusive options, whether we look at it here or here? Is going down to battle and perish mean it's not Yahweh striking him down, that it's simply the vagaries of battle? Well, Uriah went down in battle, and that certainly wasn't Yahweh's will. It was plainly David's will, and we'll see that in 2 Samuel 11, of course. And we've already seen several references to the David, Bathsheba, Uriah, and Nathan story just in these last verses and in chapter 25. So that's not far removed to imagine hearing that there. But David isn't claiming that one of these are so. He's simply saying, it won't be me. I won't be the one who does that. And it's not he who does it. So we continue down here to the other side of the chiasm, and he continues by saying, Yahweh forbid that I should raise my hand against the Lord's anointed, using that strong phrase, Halilah li, which we saw earlier in 24:7. Again, the exact same phrase here. That I should raise my hand, and then finishing the chiasm, but now, he says, this is 13 times in these 3 chapters, but not so many here. We saw it was a key word in chapter 24. But now, take the spear that is at his head and the water jar and let us go. And notice what he's proposing. He's proposing to go into the circle of soldiers, and we don't know how many are there particularly, but notice at the beginning it did say that Saul had 3,000 chosen men. So however we're going to imagine a circle of 3,000 men with Saul and Abner in the middle, and somehow David and Abishai are going to sneak in there and get these things. The fact that the text told us that Yahweh put a deep sleep on them, well, actually that's the next verse. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's wait for a moment to hear that. So take the spear and the water jar. But why the water jar? It's only this scene. There's 3 times here, and then we'll see it a couple times in Kings. But as many scholars have noted, taking the water jar is a real threat. They're in the desert, as we've seen. So it's one thing to cut off the corner of his cloak, which is simply symbolic, and even taking the spear, well, there are more spears. But you take somebody's water jar out in the desert, and you're basically suggesting that they die. We can't assume that Saul's water jar, of course, is the only water jar, so for 3,000 men there must be more sources of water. But it's certainly a symbolic murder that we're seeing here. Even though he forbids that he raises his hand against the Lord's anointed, in effect he's still doing that, recognizing the ambivalence he has about the reality. Because otherwise, why take the spear in the water jar at all? But somehow he does it. Notice it said, told Abishai to do it. He says, now take. So David took. And in the Hebrew, these two lines are virtually identical. You can sort of hear that in the sequence here. Take the spear at his head and the water jar. Took the spear at his head and the water jar. So what's in the middle is simply David, framed by taking the spear at Saul's head, again repeated as we've seen, and the water jar. And so now we get the surprise, the spoiler that I already gave away. And I've translated here more literally to get the drama, because the New RSV just made it more simple and not as dramatic. So here we hear the literal. No one saw it, no one knew it, no one awoke. The word for awake or awoke here is only one other time in the Deuteronomistic history, mostly in Psalms, again one of those words that suggest a late providence for this whole unit. For they were all asleep, using the same word here earlier, but then this addition, because a deep sleep from Yahweh had fallen upon them. And the word for deep sleep, tartamoth, is used a couple times in Genesis, and 2:21 is the deep sleep on the Adam, so Yahweh could perform surgery on him and divide the Adam into the Ish and Isha, the man and the woman. In chapter 15, it was so that Abram could have that experience of the glowing fire pot after the sacrifice of the animals, and only a couple of other times, and again, Proverbs is a late example. Brueggemann notes below, deep sleep is Yahweh's way of making David safe and Saul vulnerable. And as my note below suggests, the rare occasion where the narrator reinforces the speaker's perspective, claiming Yahweh is on David's side. But because the deep sleep from Yahweh had fallen upon them does not at all mean that Yahweh is saying David should kill him. It might simply mean that, David, you can get away this time again. But that's not exactly what's going to happen. What's going to happen next time, as we can just see briefly, is David's going to go over to the other side of the mountain and call out to Abner, who will not answer. But we'll get to that one next time. See you then. Bye-bye.